I should have trusted my gut when I saw them standing at the gates of Brighton Grove Academy, Leila and Brielle, side by side, dressed in uniforms that didn't belong to them, in a school that never planned to welcome them. My sisters looked like they were ready to conquer the world, heads high, eyes focused, shoulders squared as if the concrete under their feet couldn't crack them. But I knew better. I knew Brookridge, North Carolina. I knew how places like this worked. I told my father we shouldn't send them there. I told him that kind of school only opens its doors to girls like them to check a box, not to let them thrive. But he just looked at me, calm as always, and said, "They're ready. I raised them to walk through fire." He meant it. He believed it. And honestly, sometimes I wish he hadn't. Leila and Brielle aren't soft. Never have been. They've been training in martial arts since they were kids. Our dad made sure of that. Self-discipline, control, strength, not just physical, but emotional. They don't fold under pressure. They don't break easily. But even steel bends when it's hammered long enough, and Brighton Grove. That place came with hammers dressed as hallway smiles and soft-voiced teachers. I remember that first morning too clearly. The sun hit the stone path like it was trying to bless their entrance. The brick buildings looked peaceful, proud, perfect. Everything manicured. Everything polished. But underneath it all, I could feel it, the silence. That sharp, heavy kind of quiet that doesn't come from calm, but from judgment. The kind that watches, waits, and decides you don't belong before you ever say a word. The students barely looked at them. When they did, it was with the kind of curiosity reserved for animals at a zoo. Some laughed under their breath. Some whispered behind hands with perfect nails. No one smiled. No one welcomed. Not really. And the faculty? Cold politeness. Tight smiles. Eyes that passed over them like they were already too much trouble. But my sisters, they didn't flinch. They walked right through it like it was smoke. Not because they didn't feel it, but because they were trained not to show it. Leila's jaw clenched the way it always does when she's biting back words. Brielle's fingers gripped her backpack strap like it was a lifeline. And still, they smiled at me when I waved goodbye. I watched them walk through those tall glass doors like it was a movie I'd seen before. One where the ending was already written. And I hate that I was right. What hits me hardest isn't what happened later. It's the days right after that. The slow shift. The way they started talking less at dinner. The way Brielle would disappear into the garage and hit the punching bag in total silence. The way Leila's laugh started sounding forced, short, clipped, like she was trying not to let anything slip out that she couldn't take back. They kept saying everything was fine. But fine has 1,000 meanings, and none of them are real. Not when you're the only black girls in a school built for silence and legacy. Not when you're expected to be perfect while they poke holes in your pride just to see how fast you leak. My father stayed calm, of course. That's his thing. He says storms pass. But I've lived long enough to know that some storms don't just pass, you either stand through them or get swept under. And I could see it in their eyes, in the small things they didn't say, that Brighton Grove wasn't just a challenge, it was a quiet war. And the thing about quiet wars? They don't explode all at once. They build. Whisper by whisper. Smile by smirk. Until one day, something small turns into something that doesn't go away. Something you can't walk past anymore. Something you have to fight. And I think that moment was already coming. I just didn't know how loud it would get. It started like it always does, in small, almost invisible ways. A locker that mysteriously jams every other morning. A textbook gone missing, only to show up days later with scribbles that weren't there before. Whispers that stop when you walk into the room. Laughter that doesn't match the moment, but somehow you know it's about you. At Brighton Grove, racism doesn't wear a hood. It wears a blazer. A prefect badge. a polished smile. And my sisters? They were targets the moment they stepped on that lawn. They didn't talk about it, not at first. But I saw the changes. Leila started tapping her pen against the dinner table, over and over, like she couldn't quite settle. Brielle? She'd go out to the garage and hit the bag in complete silence. Just steady thuds echoing through the house. It was like they were holding something in, trying to bleed it out through motion. The worst part was the quiet. Not from them, from everyone else. The school staff. The teachers. The other students. They all saw it. Maybe not the words, but the tone. The tone is always there. The deliberate mispronunciations. The way Carter Winslow and his friends would bump into them in the hallway and say, "Oops," with grins that meant anything but sorry. Carter, he's the kind of kid who thinks the world owes him something because of the family name on his sweater. Blonde, tall, always walking like he's being filmed. And when he saw Leila and Brielle, he didn't see equals. He saw disruption. And he hated it. Hated them. Not because they did anything. Because they didn't bow. He started with jokes. Didn't know we had a cleaning staff attending classes now. Hey, twins, do you mop as good as you test? And his boys, Mason and Cole, laughed like it was comedy gold. They loved having an audience. Loved that no one stopped them. That the hallway gave them room and let them perform. And the girls, they held the line. Every single time. They didn't flinch. They didn't speak. They walked on like the air wasn't filled with poison. But I know what it takes to stay that calm. That's not peace. That's pressure. And it builds. I remember one night, Leila came home and sat at the edge of the couch without saying anything. Just stared at her shoes for 10, maybe 15 minutes. When I asked what was wrong, she looked up at me with this expression I still can't forget. Not angry. Not scared. Just, tired. She said, "I feel like I have to ask for permission just to breathe in that school." Then she stood up and went to bed. And our dad? He noticed too. Of course he did. But he stuck to the plan. Discipline over impulse, he always says. Let them think you're weak. That's when you strike hardest. But I didn't want them to strike. I wanted them out. Out of that school, out of that place, out of that silence that was slowly killing the fire in their eyes. The thing is, Leila and Brielle were never weak. They were patient. Trained. Controlled. And Carter couldn't stand it. He wanted them to explode. He wanted them to scream, to fight, to cry. Anything he could twist and throw back at them. But they didn't. Not yet. So he pushed harder. And when words stopped working, he got creative. One afternoon, they came home late. Didn't say why. Didn't need to. Their faces were tight, their movements stiff, like they'd spent the day holding something heavy. I asked what happened. Leila shook her head. Brielle just whispered, nothing new. But I could tell. Something had shifted. The next day, I drove past the school during my lunch break. Just a quick loop, I told myself. Just to see. And that's when I saw it, Carter and his crew, leaning against the wall outside the main entrance, laughing like kings. And there, at the edge of the crowd, my sisters walking by with their heads up and jaws set, like they were walking through fire again and daring it to burn them. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with ordinary bullying. This wasn't just about teasing. It was about trying to break them. Slowly. Publicly. Without leaving a bruise you could show. But Carter didn't know what I knew. He didn't know what Leila and Brielle were made of. And I think, deep down, they were already done playing nice. They were waiting. Waiting for the line to be crossed. And Carter? He was about to cross it. There's this kind of silence that comes right before something breaks, the kind that creeps in slowly, coats everything in stillness, and somehow lets you know you won't come out the same on the other side. That's how the morning felt. Off. Too quiet. I dropped my sisters off, watched them walk to the entrance of Brighton Grove, and I don't know why, but something in my chest didn't sit right. A few hours later, I got the call. Brielle didn't sound scared. That's not who she is. But there was something sharp under her voice, like she was holding back everything just to keep it together. All she said was, "You need to see it for yourself." And then she hung up. When I got there, the hallway was packed. Kids with phones out, laughter echoing off the walls like it was some kind of party. At first, I couldn't even tell what I was looking at. Then I saw the lockers. Leila's. Brielle's. Drenched in thick red paint, dripping down like blood. It wasn't just a prank. It was a message. Slurs. Drawn bold and loud. Dehumanizing sketches of their faces, twisted and stretched into something ugly. It wasn't just cruel, it was surgical. Someone wanted to humiliate them, erase their dignity right there in front of everyone. And standing a few feet back, arms crossed, was Carter Winslow. Watching it all. Like a director admiring the scene he orchestrated. Mason and Cole were with him, grinning. Proud. But what got me wasn't the paint or the cowards behind it. It was the silence from everyone else. Teachers passed by and said nothing. Students filmed it. Some laughed, some just stared. Not one of them stepped in. It wasn't just an act of hate. It was permission. Public, shameless permission to treat my sisters like they didn't belong. Leila stood still. Brielle too. Not broken. Not shouting. Just, locked down. I know that look. It's the same one they wear during sparring, calm on the outside, fire just beneath the surface. And when they turned toward each other, there was no question about what came next. Later that night, they didn't talk much. Just sat at the kitchen table, wiping paint off their backpacks in silence. Our dad stood nearby, arms folded, watching. Then he said it, quiet but clear, they crossed the line. Leila looked up. There's no line left. And in that moment, I knew something had changed. Not just in them, in all of us. The school couldn't pretend anymore. Brighton Grove had always been polished on the outside and rotten underneath, but this time, the rot spilled out in red for everyone to see. And Carter? He thought he'd broken them. He thought they'd hide, transfer, disappear. But he has no idea who my sisters really are. They don't fold under pressure. They sharpen. And now. They're ready. After the locker incident, the school didn't just feel hostile, it felt unstable. Like a building with cracked walls and too much weight pressing down. People still laughed, sure. Still stared. But something had changed. The tension was sharper now, closer to the edge. Like the whole place knew it had crossed a line, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. And Carter? He was too proud to notice the shift. Too smug to feel the ground moving under his feet. He strutted through the halls like a king with a paper crown, smiling like he'd won. But I saw it, how his eyes flicked toward my sisters now. More often. A little too long. Because even he could feel it. The countdown had started. The next day, it all came to a head. Second period had just ended. The courtyard buzzed with noise, the usual energy of kids killing time between classes. But when Leila and Brielle stepped outside, it was like the volume dipped. Not all the way. Just enough for everyone to notice. And then Carter made his move. He stepped into their path, casual at first, like this was all just another joke. "Morning, ladies," he said, with that same syrupy tone he always used when he was about to say something disgusting. "Just thought I'd check in." Lockers still looking too clean. Shame. I brought supplies. Then he dropped a can of red spray paint at their feet. It clattered against the bricks like a gun hitting the ground. And everything stopped. For a beat, no one spoke. No one even breathed. Phones were already out. The audience was forming. Carter smiled like a magician about to reveal the trick. Didn't want you to forget your color. Leila didn't move. Neither did Brielle. They just looked at the can. Then looked at him. Leila's voice was quiet when it came, but it cut like wire. You really want to cross this line? Brielle took a step forward. You think you're writing your legacy with this, she said, tone colder than steel. All you're doing is signing your name to the fall. Carter let out a laugh, but even from where I stood, I could see his jaw tighten. The crowd didn't laugh with him. They just watched. Waiting. Curious. And then Leila did something none of us expected. She picked up the paint can. And crushed it in her fist. Carter blinked. Just once. Then, he stepped back. He tried to smile again, tried to recover, but it was too late. The crowd had seen it. That tiny step. That crack in the armor. There's something terrifying about watching the moment your sisters decide they're done holding back, not because they've run out of patience, but because they've realized no one else is going to do the right thing. They didn't speak much at breakfast, just exchanged quiet glances with Dad, who didn't ask questions anymore. He didn't need to. He knew what they knew. Some things don't get solved with meetings or apologies, some things only change when someone stands up and refuses to be pushed again. When we got to Brighton Grove, the entire school felt like it was waiting. Not for class. Not for learning. For confrontation. The locker room whispers had grown louder overnight, but now there was no laughter behind them, just anticipation. Phones were half out of backpacks already, like everyone could sense what was coming and no one wanted to miss it. And Carter? He was already in the courtyard, leaning against the wall like he'd been waiting all morning just to throw the next punch, not with his hands yet, but with his mouth, which had always been his favorite weapon. He saw them approach, and something shifted in his face, not fear, not yet, but recognition. Somewhere deep down, I think he knew he'd gone too far. He just didn't know how far Leila and Brielle were willing to go to remind him. He pushed himself off the wall, trying to make it look casual, but it wasn't. He said something loud, something about paint and color and, you people, and a few students chuckled, but it felt forced, like even they weren't sure if they were supposed to laugh. Brielle didn't stop walking. Neither did Leila. They walked right up to him, slow and steady, and when Carter stepped into their path, like he'd done a dozen times before, this time Brielle dropped her backpack without saying a word, and the sound it made when it hit the ground was small but sharp, like a trigger. Carter tried to smirk, tried to throw another insult, but Leila was already moving, quick, clean, without hesitation. He reached for her, not fast enough, and she drove her palm into his chest with a force that knocked the wind out of him in one silent, humiliating second. He stumbled back, gasping, his arms flailing to keep balance, and before anyone could even register what had happened, Mason and Cole rushed in, loyal to a fault but dumb enough to believe this would end the way it always had. It didn't. Brielle met them head-on, spinning under Mason's arm, catching his wrist and dropping him flat with a twist that looked effortless. Cole came next, heavier but slower, and she swept his legs with one sharp kick, sending him crashing down beside his friend. The courtyard had gone dead silent. Not even the teachers were pretending to interfere this time. Some of them were watching too. Carter, red-faced and furious, lunged at Leila again, fists wild, but she stepped aside like she was dancing, grabbed his collar, and flipped him straight to the ground with such brutal control that for the first time, he didn't bounce back. He just lay there, staring up at the sky, gasping like he'd forgotten how to breathe. I didn't move. No one did. There was no need. Because in that moment, everyone understood that this wasn't an outburst. It wasn't chaos. It was justice. Leila and Brielle didn't scream, didn't curse, didn't perform, they defended themselves with the kind of precision you don't fake. The kind that comes from training and pain and years of learning that sometimes strength isn't about who hits first, but who refuses to flinch when it finally matters. Carter had wanted to put on a show. And he got one. Just not the one he thought he was directing. Because the story had changed now, and the whole school knew it. If you've never sat in a school hallway outside the principal's office while your world unravels behind a closed door, let me tell you, it doesn't feel like waiting. It feels like being put on pause while someone else decides what version of the story will be told. And when it's your sisters sitting beside you, silent but breathing like they just walked through fire, you start to realize something else: silence isn't peace. Sometimes, silence is just the sound of justice trying to hold its breath. After the courtyard, after the fight, the gasps, the phones, the slow-motion fall of everything Carter built, we were pulled into the office not by security, not by some dramatic, handcuffed scene, but by Mrs. Hampton, the vice principal, who looked more shaken than angry. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't lecture. She just said, "Come with me," in a tone like she'd finally seen the part of the school she'd spent years pretending didn't exist. She didn't know what to do with it. So she led them here. Leila sat on my left, Brielle on my right, both of them calm in that quiet way that doesn't invite conversation. Their hands were still. Their faces unreadable. But their breathing, it was heavy. Not from exhaustion, but from release. I could feel it like heat off their skin. They'd held back for so long, waited for someone else to step in, and now that they finally hadn't, now that they'd taken matters into their own hands, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like inevitability. Inside the office, we could hear muffled voices. Carter, probably. His mother, too. Her voice sharper, high-pitched, frantic in that performative way people like her default to when they realize money and fake smiles can't stop momentum. I imagined her pacing, pointing, demanding suspensions, expulsions, apologies. Rewriting what had happened like it was still up for negotiation. I could picture Carter too, his voice cracked with just enough fake fear to frame himself as the victim, forgetting the way his hand had curled into a fist before anything ever happened. But the door never slammed. That's what I remember most. No yelling. No chaos. Just low voices, paperwork sliding across desks, people who knew that if they lost control now, they'd lose the whole narrative. It wasn't long before Dad arrived. He walked down that hallway like he'd already been here 100 times, not out of habit, but out of principle. The kind of man who doesn't need to rehearse what he's going to say, because he knows the truth always walks in first. When he saw my sisters, he didn't ask what happened. Didn't speak at all for a few seconds. Just looked at them. Checked their eyes. Checked their posture. And when he nodded, barely, they nodded back, and I swear it was like the whole building shifted. Like the foundation remembered who it had underestimated. Mr. Carrington, the headmaster, came out next. Pale. Tight-lipped. His clipboard was trembling just slightly in his hand, like he wasn't sure whether he was holding authority or excuses. He gestured for Dad to come in. Leila and Brielle stood without being asked. They weren't afraid of what was coming. Not anymore. They had already crossed the line everyone else had spent months pretending wasn't there. And now the school had to decide what side of that line it wanted to stand on. The meeting wasn't long. That's the part that gets me. After everything, weeks of slurs, silence, bruises, and paint, the school wrapped it all up in under 20 minutes. Like if they moved fast enough, maybe they wouldn't have to face what let this happen in the first place. I sat outside that door, waiting, counting every muffled sentence like a heartbeat, and when it finally opened, no one looked victorious. Not Carrington. Not the assistant principal. Not even Carter's mother, whose lipstick was still perfect but whose voice had dropped an octave into something less performative, more bitter. The only ones who looked steady were the ones who'd taken the hits from the very start, Leila and Brielle, walking out behind Dad like nothing in that room had surprised them. Because it hadn't. We didn't talk in the hallway. Not yet. But as we moved past the offices, through the lobby, out into the morning that suddenly felt brighter than it should have been, I could tell from the way students looked at us, whispers behind locker doors, gazes dropped mid-conversation, that the story had already spread. Only this time, it didn't come with smirks or snide remarks. This time, it came with distance. Respect. Maybe even a little fear. And I realized something in that moment that made my throat tighten: they had finally been seen. Not as troublemakers. Not as outsiders. But as girls who stood in the fire and didn't burn. Back at home, Dad laid out the suspension papers on the kitchen table, looked over them with the same slow control he always had when reading something meant to intimidate. They weren't permanent. Just 3 days. For everyone involved, Carrington had said, like that made it fair. Like 3 names on a paper meant 3 people were equally guilty. But we knew better. And so did Dad. He stood there for a long time without saying anything. Just breathing. Then he looked up at Leila and Brielle, his eyes steady, tired maybe, but proud in a way that didn't need words. They gave you consequences, he finally said, voice low and even, because they couldn't give you credit. Leila nodded once. Not out of agreement, but acknowledgement. She didn't need anyone's credit. She never had. That weekend passed slowly. No outings. No calls. Just us, in the house, letting the dust settle. But under that quiet was something alive, something that had shifted. I saw it in the way Brielle trained harder in the garage, her strikes sharper, more focused. I saw it in Leila's notebooks, now filled with outlines for an essay she was writing, not for school, but for herself. About how silence is never neutral. About how you don't fix injustice by balancing punishment, you fix it by telling the truth out loud, where everyone can hear it. When Monday came, the 3-day suspension was over. And we returned. We didn't say a word as we walked through the gates. Leila and Brielle were in uniform, bags slung over their shoulders, heads high. But the energy around them was different now. The hallways didn't push them anymore. The glances weren't sharp. Even the silence had changed shape, no longer a void, but a boundary. No one dared cross it. Carter wasn't there. Neither were his boys. No one said why. No one needed to. And Carrington? He met us near the front office, tried to offer something like a nod, something like a welcome, but it fell flat. Because authority without responsibility is just decoration. And Leila, without missing a step, walked past him like he wasn't part of the equation anymore. They went to class. Sat at their desks. Answered when called on. And just like that, they reclaimed the space that tried to reject them. But the final moment, the one I still replay, was after school. As we crossed the courtyard, the same one where it all began, a younger student, probably a freshman, dark-skinned, shy, clutching her books like armor, walked past my sisters. And she looked up. Just for a second. Just long enough to meet Leila's gaze. And what passed between them wasn't words. It was recognition. Permission. Maybe even safety. And Leila? She gave the girl the smallest, fiercest nod I'd ever seen. They came in quiet. They left unshaken.